The marble walls of the Vatican have witnessed centuries of tradition, ceremony, and spiritual power. But on a cold morning in Rome, Pope Leo XIV did something that stunned both his security team and the world. Cameras weren't rolling, there were no reporters. But one quiet act, simple and unscripted, told the world more about the man behind the papal robes than any speech ever could. It began on a cold Roman morning just before sunrise, when the city still slumbered beneath a grey winter sky. The cobblestone streets around St. Peter's Square glistened with a fine dew, and the great dome of the basilica loomed like a silent guardian above the Vatican. The usual murmurs of morning prayer and rustling tourist maps were still hours away. In this moment of stillness, only the wind moved, whispering through the colonnades, weaving through ancient statues, and tugging gently at a tattered blanket beneath one of the great marble pillars. Beneath that blanket was a man. His name was Marco. No one knew it then, not even the Swiss guards posted nearby. To them, he was just another faceless figure slumped on Vatican ground, an unremarkable part of the scenery in a city too ancient to flinch at suffering. But Marco had once been someone. A carpenter from Naples, he had learned the trade from his father, whose rough hands had taught him to turn blocks of wood into beauty. Marco built cribs, bookshelves, and even church pews. He once worked on restoring an old cathedral's doors, breathing life back into their weary oak. He had a wife, a daughter, a small dog named Tito. All gone now. The pandemic had taken his business. The recession had taken his savings. The grief, which came like a wave, had taken the rest. Marco drifted, like so many before him, toward the city of saints, hoping to feel something divine in the shadow of the church. But the Vatican was not a place for sleeping men. Its stone was cold, and its people moved fast. Tourists pointed cameras, but avoided eye contact. Priests walked past in silence. And the guards, though not unkind, had told him more than once that he could not stay here forever. Marco didn't ask for help, not anymore. His cardboard sign, once scrawled with hungry pleas, had grown and soft and soggy from the Roman fog. Now it lay at his feet, unread and unnoticed. He sat cross-legged, wrapped in an old wool coat, looking not outward but down, his gaze fixed on a chipped cup of water and a cracked photograph of his daughter when she was 8. He wasn't praying. He wasn't cursing. He wasn't doing much of anything, really. Just breathing. Just existing. And yet, something about him felt impossibly heavy, as if the full weight of human despair had settled in his posture. He looked like he had stopped hoping long ago, and learned to survive on the echo of what once mattered. Every morning, Marco would watch the Vatican's gates open to the public. He'd listen to the rhythmic shuffle of shoes on stone, the creak of camera straps, the burst of languages he didn't understand. He never expected to be noticed, least of all by someone like him. But unknown to Marco, someone had noticed. And not from a distance, not from a passing glance, not from pity. For the past 3 days, a figure had stood behind the tall windows of the Apostolic Palace, watching quietly as Marco arrived each dawn to take his place among the pillars. Most assumed the Pope's mornings were filled with sacred texts and scheduled meetings. Few would have imagined that he spent part of that time staring at a single man wrapped in a grey blanket. wondering perhaps what it meant that someone could sleep so close to the heart of the church and still be invisible. There was something haunting in that image, something sacred in its sadness. And on this particular morning, something inside Pope Leo XIV broke loose from protocol, from routine, from the centuries of walls, ceremonial, psychological, and otherwise, that separated popes from the people. But Marco, cold and motionless, knew nothing of what was coming. He didn't know that the Pope had seen him. He didn't know that his silent suffering had stirred a man whose every step was usually choreographed by tradition and security. All Marco knew was that his body ached, his lips were dry, and the sun would be rising soon over the stones of St. Peter's. He had no idea the course of his life, and perhaps the character of a pontificate, was about to change forever. The Vatican operates like a finely tuned machine. Every step, every moment, every movement is choreographed to preserve centuries of sacred tradition. From the timing of morning masses to the angle at which the Swiss guards stand during a papal procession, nothing is left to chance. And above all, the Pope, God's representative on earth, is expected to remain a figure both revered and protected, removed from the unpredictable rhythms of ordinary life. That is how it has always been, until that morning. As the sun climbed slowly above the horizon, casting a golden sheen over the Vatican's ancient stones, the usual preparations for the Pope's morning walk were already underway. Inside the Apostolic Palace, aides straightened vestments, reviewed scheduled meetings, and ensured that the carefully chosen route for the brief public appearance was clear of any obstructions. The Swiss guards stood ready, tall and motionless in their Renaissance uniforms, loyal, alert, and trained to react in an instant. Pope Leo XIV emerged from his private quarters just before 7 a.m., accompanied by his two closest advisors and a small procession of assistants. He wore the simple white cassock he had always preferred over more elaborate papal garments. His silver pectoral cross hung low, swaying gently with each step. At a glance, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But those closest to him noticed a subtle change in his expression. His eyes were distant, as if his mind had slipped free from the moment. As they stepped through the Vatican doors into the crisp morning air, the group moved in practiced silence across the stone plaza. Tourists and pilgrims, already gathered along the fences, gasped in hushed reverence as they caught sight of the pontiff. Cell phones lifted, shutter clicks echoed softly, and murmurs in a dozen languages filled the square. The Pope acknowledged the crowd with a gentle nod, raising his hand in quiet blessing. Everything was unfolding exactly as expected, until it didn't. Without warning, the Pope stopped. At first, his entourage didn't realise what was happening. The line of aides took 2 steps further before noticing that Leo had halted in place, his gaze fixed beyond the colonnade, toward a dark shape slumped beside one of the stone columns. One of his advisors, alarmed, leaned in. "Holy Father," he whispered. But the Pope didn't answer. He was staring at Marco. There was a flicker in his eyes, something raw, something unfiltered. A conflict was happening behind them. The weight of centuries of papal separation versus the undeniable pull of something human, something divine, that defied every rule in the book. He hesitated for only a moment, then turned, completely away from the designated path, and began walking toward the edge of the square. At first, no one moved. It was as if time had stalled. One of the Swiss guards stepped forward instinctively, placing a hand on the hilt of his sword, his eyes scanning the area for threats. A few aides called out softly, asking the Pope to return to the procession. A Vatican photographer hesitated. Should he follow? Should he take pictures? But the Pope kept walking. The murmurs from the crowd rose. People leaned over the barriers, trying to see where the Pope was headed. Some thought he had spotted a sick child or an old friend. Others thought it was a mistake, that perhaps he had grown disoriented or confused. But those closest to him knew this was not confusion. It was intention. Pope Leo XIV approached slowly, deliberately, as Marco sat hunched against the stone. The homeless man had not yet noticed the small stir occurring just meters from him. He was rubbing his palms together, trying to warm his fingertips, his head bowed to his chest. When he finally looked up, he blinked against the sunlight and squinted at the approaching figure. At first, he didn't recognize him. Why would he? But then, Marco's eyes widened. The man in white, the one walking directly toward him, was the Pope. Marco struggled to rise, unsure of what to do. He half stood, then faltered, then dropped back down, looking around in confusion as the crowd beyond the gates began to murmur louder. The Swiss guards were tense now, keeping a wide berth but monitoring every twitch, every movement. This wasn't how things were done. This wasn't allowed. And yet the Pope kept walking. When he reached Marco, he didn't speak right away. He didn't demand that Marco stand. He didn't call for a translator. Instead, he knelt. The marble was cold. His knees touched the stone without hesitation. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. From a distance, one might have thought the Pope was praying. But up close, it became clear. He was simply being present. No bodyguards flanking him. No camera lenses in his face. No official statements prepared. Just a man with white robes, kneeling beside a forgotten soul. One of the guards took a step forward, but a hand from the Pope's assistant stopped him. No. Let him be. People in the square stood frozen. Tourists stopped filming. Priests and nuns looked on in awe. The photographers had no clear line of sight, and even if they had, the Pope wasn't doing this for a headline. What happened next wouldn't be captured by press releases or papal decrees. It wouldn't become a bullet point in any speech. But for those who saw it, for those who felt it, it became a moment burned into memory. In that one act, Pope Leo XIV did what no protocol could predict. He crossed the invisible line between leader and servant, between figurehead and human. He knelt on the same cold ground as Marco, not above him, but with him. And with that, the stage was set, not for spectacle, but for something far more powerful, something that would ripple through the marble halls of the Vatican for days to come. The square was quieter now, not because the crowds had left. If anything, more people were arriving by the minute, but because something sacred hung in the air. It was the kind of silence that doesn't come from the absence of sound, but from reverence, awe, disbelief. The kind of silence that descends on people when they know they are witnessing something that can't be explained in ordinary terms. Pope Leo XIV was sitting on the stone beside Marco. It wasn't a calculated posture. He hadn't knelt with ceremonial grace or arranged his robes for dignity. He had simply lowered himself slowly, joints stiff from age, until he was sitting cross-legged, mirroring the man beside him. The hem of his cassock dragged along the dusty pavement. His white zucchetto had fallen slightly askew. And yet, he looked more regal in that moment than he ever had on the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica. Marco stared at him in disbelief. His mouth opened slightly, as if to speak, but no words came out. His eyes darted to the Pope's face, then to the guards in the distance, then to the people gathering behind the security rails, and then back to the Pope again. It was as if his mind refused to accept what his eyes were showing him. The Pope was sitting next to a homeless man on the street, and no one was stopping him. Leo turned toward Marco and gave a small smile. It wasn't a grand or theatrical expression. It was warm, tired, and utterly human. He reached into his robe pocket and pulled out something small, insignificant to anyone watching from afar. A small wooden cross. It was smooth from years of handling, its edges worn down, its grain barely visible. He held it out in the palm of his hand, gently offering it to Marco. Marco looked at the cross as if it were made of gold. His hand trembled as he reached out, then stopped, pulling back. "I can't," he said softly, in Italian. "I'm dirty." The Pope said nothing for a moment. He simply took Marco's hand in his own, wrinkled fingers grasping rough, calloused skin, and gently placed the cross in his palm. Now they were both holding it. Then finally, Leo spoke. "You're not dirty," he said, his voice low and firm. "You are tired, and that is not a sin." Marco's eyes welled with tears. He tried to blink them back, to hold on to whatever sliver of dignity he thought he still possessed. But the tears came anyway. He wasn't crying loudly, just quiet, shaking sobs that came from somewhere deep, somewhere long untouched. The kind of crying that doesn't ask for help, but breaks under the weight of being seen. No one had touched Marco in months. People tossed coins, handed out wrapped sandwiches, offered blessings from a distance, but no one had sat with him. No one had made him feel real. Until now. The Pope continued to hold Marco's hand, saying nothing more for a long while. Not every moment needed words, especially this one. Around them, the crowd remained eerily quiet. Phones were lowered, eyes were wide. Even the guards had softened, no longer standing like statues, but watching with expressions somewhere between caution and wonder. One of the nearby nuns whispered a prayer under her breath. A child on his father's shoulders whispered, "Who is that man?" The father answered, "That's the Pope." The child paused, confused. "But why is he sitting on the ground?" It was a question many were asking. The Pope finally released Marco's hand and looked up at the sky for a long moment. The sun was rising fully now, bathing the stone pillars in gold and casting long shadows across the square. He exhaled slowly, then looked back at Marco. "Where do you sleep at night?" he asked quietly. Marco shrugged. "Different places. I move when I'm told." Leo nodded. "No one should live that way." "I don't have a choice." The Pope was silent again. Then, almost as if to himself, he said, "The church was never meant to have gates." That line would later be repeated countless times, quoted in articles and sermons and social media posts. But in that moment, no one wrote it down. It wasn't a message for the world. It was a confession, a realization, a moment of raw truth shared between two men, one robed in white, the other wrapped in threadbare grey. Suddenly, Marco reached into his coat. He pulled out a worn photograph, creased at the edges, its colours faded from sunlight and time. It was of a young girl, maybe 8 years old, with a gap-toothed smile and ribbons in her hair. "My daughter," he said. "I haven't seen her in 5 years. She's in Florence, I think." The Pope took the photo and studied it carefully, as if it were a sacred relic. "She has your eyes," he said gently. Marco nodded and wiped his nose with his sleeve. "I was a carpenter," he added, before everything fell apart." Leo looked at him, and a strange smile tugged at his lips. So was he. For the first time, Marco chuckled. It was small and cracked, but real. The Pope smiled back. They sat together for a few more minutes, saying little else. The crowds were growing again. Vatican staff were becoming visibly anxious. Advisors exchanged glances, debating whether to approach. One guard discreetly checked his earpiece, but no one moved. Eventually the Pope stood. He did so slowly, carefully, as if not to shatter the sacred quiet of the moment. He extended a hand and helped Marco to his feet. For a man who had once knelt before kings and presidents, helping a homeless man to his feet was perhaps the most radical gesture of his life. He placed a hand on Marco's shoulder. "We'll find you a place." "Please," he said. "You deserve rest." Marco didn't reply. He was still holding the wooden cross. The Pope turned, gave one final glance, and began walking back toward the Vatican gates. The guards fell in line. The aides followed. The photographers, suddenly uncertain whether to take pictures or remain reverent, stood back. And Marco? He stood alone, the cross clutched to his chest, tears drying on his face, watching the man in white disappear behind the marble gates. But something had shifted. He was no longer invisible. Inside the ancient walls of the Vatican, few things go unnoticed. Every word whispered in its corridors, every deviation from established routine, every look exchanged between cardinals and clergy. It all carries weight. And so, when Pope Leo XIV returned to his private quarters after that morning's extraordinary moment beside Marco, the silence that followed was not the comfortable silence of business as usual. It was a silence loaded with tension, questions, and the buzzing energy of something unspoken rippling through the hierarchy. For decades, perhaps centuries, the Vatican had existed like a sealed vessel, guarding not just relics and traditions, but a certain image of spiritual leadership, distant, measured, bound by ritual. The Pope's choice to kneel beside a homeless man, outside the walls, without cameras, without formal blessing, was not only unconventional, it was unprecedented in modern papal history. The Curia, the administrative heart of the Church, felt the shock almost immediately. Meetings that morning were interrupted. Secretaries shuffled between offices, clutching folders, but whispering instead of speaking. Cardinal Bellini, a man known for his rigid orthodoxy and precise speech, reportedly asked 3 different aides whether the reports were true. Did His Holiness really sit on the ground? Was he alone? Was the man touched? Security officers submitted formal incident reports detailing the deviation from protocol. Though the situation had remained safe, one line stood out to all who read it. The Pope ordered us to stand down. Within hours, speculation bloomed like wildfire, first within Vatican walls and then into the world beyond. Though no official statement had been issued, someone had spoken to someone, and soon a rumour emerged online. The Pope had stopped his procession to sit with a homeless man outside the colonnade. Photos had not yet surfaced, none clear enough to confirm the event. But the mere idea was enough to ignite conversations on social media and in newsrooms across Europe. Catholic journalists were among the first to respond. Some hailed the gesture as a return to the roots of Christ's ministry, likening Leo XIV to St. Francis or even to Jesus himself, who famously walked among lepers and dined with outcasts. Others were more cautious. Conservative voices warned that such informality might dilute the authority of the papal office or encourage misinterpretation of his role. Inside the Vatican, the tension built as members of the hierarchy tried to decide what to do with the event. Should they embrace it, bury it, spin it? Meanwhile, Pope Leo XIV said nothing. He did not summon a press conference. He did not draft an official homily addressing what had happened. He returned to his room, placed his ring on the side table, and reportedly sat in quiet contemplation for over an hour. But the Vatican could not remain quiet for long. The next day, something unexpected happened. When pilgrims entered St. Peter's Square that morning, they found something new beside the colonnade where Marco had once sat: a bench. Not an ornate bench made of marble or gilded bronze, but a simple wooden bench, rough-hewn, as if carved by hand, with visible grain and knots and imperfections. It sat in the same spot Marco had been found, fixed into the ground with no explanation. Next to it was a small silver plaque. It read, "He who lifts the forgotten lifts Christ himself." No name was attributed to the quote. No church branding or papal crest marked the plaque. But no one doubted its origin. The installation became an instant point of pilgrimage. People knelt beside the bench. Some left flowers. Others left small crosses or handwritten notes. One woman left a worn photograph of her late husband, wrapped in a handkerchief. Another left a small piece of bread and a thermos of coffee, in case he comes back. Marco, however, was nowhere to be found. Rumours swirled. Some said he had been quietly escorted to a shelter organised by the Vatican's almoner, Cardinal Vincenzo d'Arco, a man known for his quiet acts of charity. Others claimed he had been offered work restoring old wooden furniture in one of the lesser-known basilicas, under the watchful eye of retired monks. The Vatican, true to its nature, offered no public comment. Behind closed doors, however, debates raged. Bishops argued in hushed tones. Some feared the gesture would open a floodgate of expectations. Others worried about security risks, about precedent, about how the world would interpret a pope so willing to discard centuries of structured hierarchy. But a smaller, quieter group, many of them younger priests and newly appointed bishops, felt something entirely different: hope. They saw in the Pope's action a return to the heartbeat of their faith, a realignment with the stories they had been taught as children. The moment felt less like a disruption and more like a homecoming, and they whispered to one another that perhaps the Church, in all its grandeur, had finally remembered why it existed in the first place. In seminaries across the world, the story was retold like scripture. In churches, parishioners brought it up after Mass, asking if it was true. Teachers mentioned it in theology classes. Street preachers used it as a parable. And though there was still no official photo, someone had sketched an image based on eyewitness accounts. The Pope, seated cross-legged, offering a cross to a man in rags. The sketch circulated online, gathering millions of shares. The world may not have seen the exact moment, but it felt the aftershock. Within a week, new initiatives were quietly launched under the direction of Pope Leo. One allowed small teams to bring blankets, food, and warm beverages to those sleeping near the Vatican perimeter. Another involved opening part of an unused Vatican property as a transitional shelter. These changes were not heralded with fanfare, but they were real, tangible. They began reshaping the way the church interacted with the least of its flock. And perhaps most surprising of all, the Pope still said nothing. He allowed the world to talk, to debate, to guess. But he remained silent, not because he had no answer, but because he knew the act itself was the message. In an age of endless headlines, speeches, and posturing, he had chosen something radically different. He had chosen to kneel, to sit, to listen. And in doing so, he said more than 1,000 sermons ever could. In the months that followed, the moment between Pope Leo XIV and the homeless man named Marco refused to fade into obscurity. It didn't go viral in the conventional sense, not because it wasn't compelling, but because it wasn't designed for spectacle. The few blurry images that had surfaced were hauntingly beautiful. The Pope, seated on the pavement, his white cassock dusted with street grime. A hunched figure beside him, wrapped in a threadbare coat. There was no photographer present at the right angle, no lighting crew, no pre-approved caption. And that, perhaps, was what made it so unforgettable. It lived in the hearts of those who witnessed it, and echoed in the whispers of those who heard it second-hand. What began as a singular act of compassion rippled outward in quiet, sometimes invisible waves, reaching further than even the Vatican could predict. Marco was never officially seen again. But that did not stop the story from evolving into something greater than one man's redemption. It became a symbol, a modern-day parable told across kitchen tables, inside classrooms, whispered in hospital rooms, and even shared from pulpits by priests who had once doubted whether the church still possessed the courage to walk the path of Christ. Bishops reported an uptick in local outreach initiatives. In small towns throughout Italy and across the global south, priests were inspired to start morning walks outside the church, greeting the poor and the forgotten. Monasteries in Spain and the Philippines reopened their gates to offer warm food and shelter, unprompted. In Latin America, young seminarians began writing essays and giving speeches about the theology of the bench, a phrase born from that simple wooden bench that had appeared in the square like a whisper of grace. And the bench itself became something of a miracle. Tourists came by the thousands, not to touch relics or gaze up at Michelangelo's dome, but to sit in silence where Marco once sat. Pilgrims would spend hours on the bench, some clutching their own crosses, others journaling, some simply weeping. People from vastly different corners of the world shared that seat, rich beside poor, devout beside doubtful, young beside old, each of them drawn by something they couldn't quite explain. No plaque named the moment. No wall displayed a date. And yet everyone who came there felt it, a sacred interruption of the ordinary. Inside the Vatican, changes began to unfold not through bold declarations, but through subtle shifts in culture. Meetings started with moments of silence, not just for prayer, but for reflection. A new department was quietly created under the Pope's direction, dedicated solely to the forgotten, those without addresses, without papers, without advocates. Their mission wasn't to offer sermons, but solutions, food, medical care, dignity. It was the first office of its kind. And then came the letters. They began arriving in trickles, at first just a few each week. Handwritten notes from people who had heard about the Pope's act and felt moved to write. Some were addressed to Pope Leo XIV directly. Others were marked simply, "To the man who knelt." One letter came from a teenage girl in Marseille who had been living on the street after running away from an abusive home. She wrote that she saw the Pope's act in a sketch online and cried for the first time in months. "It made me feel like maybe someone like me mattered," she wrote. Another came from a Protestant pastor in Detroit who admitted to having deep suspicions about the Catholic Church. "But what you did," he wrote, "was the gospel, pure and simple." A third letter came from a retired rabbi in Jerusalem who had seen the story through an Israeli news broadcast. "It reminded me of Abraham offering hospitality to strangers. Maybe holiness has no uniform." There were hundreds like them, stories, confessions, thank you notes, and quiet declarations of renewed faith. The Pope read many of them himself. Occasionally, he would underline a phrase or add a note in the margins. Most often, though, he simply read and folded them away. But not everyone responded with praise. Inside elite circles of the Church, particularly among those who had spent decades protecting its institutional identity, there was growing unease. Some cardinals whispered that Leo's actions had blurred the line between humility and recklessness. Others warned that such informality could invite scandal or set dangerous precedent. "What happens," one asked during a closed-door meeting, "if the next pope refuses to carry the weight of the throne because he prefers the ground?" Yet Leo XIV never argued. He never tried to defend his actions with theology or rhetoric. He simply continued to act. He visited shelters under the cover of night. He quietly absolved a dying man behind the steps of a forgotten parish. He wrote personal letters to people most of the world considered unimportant. Each act became a brick in a foundation that didn't need to be seen to be strong. And the world began to notice, not with fireworks or headlines, but with curiosity. Even skeptics, journalists hardened by years of political spin and staged philanthropy, admitted there was something disarmingly authentic about this Pope. One veteran Vatican correspondent wrote, "For the first time in years, it feels like the Holy Father is leading not with his title, but with his touch." What happened outside the gates of the Vatican that morning became known in some circles as the encounter. It was taught in homilies as a lesson in true presence. It was studied in seminaries as an example of pastoral theology in action. But more importantly, it was lived. The act repeated itself in thousands of unseen ways. Priests pausing to sit with addicts, nuns washing the feet of migrants, lay people embracing those they had previously ignored. The Pope had not issued a command. He had not changed doctrine, but he had embodied something far more powerful than authority. He had shown the world what grace looked like in motion. Years later, a theologian would write, "What changed the church wasn't a council or a decree. It was a man in white, sitting cross-legged in the dust, holding the hand of someone the world had forgotten." And perhaps that is how true revolutions begin. Not with noise, but with stillness. Not with the grand stage, but with the quiet bench beside the gate. Not with a crown, but with a cross shared between strangers. And in that moment, and in the many moments that followed, Pope Leo XIV reminded the world that when love breaks protocol, heaven draws near.